I want to start this segment with a clip from a debate/interview between Dan Abrams of News Nation and Meagan Kelly, who is supporting Trump. And so she tries to bring a defense of Trump in the form of articulating the verdict in the hush money case that caused Trump to be a convicted felon, trying to portray it to be illegitimate. And Dan Abrams here does a really nice job of shutting that argument down. We'll look at some moments from this debate. Then we'll get into the big news today, which is that Trump is having to sit for an interview with a probation officer. So we'll talk about that. But first, let's start with this.
And he should have recused, and he also should have granted the change of venue motion. What would have been so bad about having this case tried in a jurisdiction that has some Republicans, has some people who don't hate Donald Trump? If it was such a great case, Dan, why couldn't it have gone to Staten Island or Long Island or Rockland County?
Because the standard is not what is the political makeup of a jury pool. I mean, that's not the standard that's ever been used ever in any case in America.
Understand. But would you concede that we have crossed the Rubicon here? We're plowing new ground for the first time in 235 years, indicting a former sitting president who is now going to be the Republican nominee.
I agree on that.
In this case,
which I've said it before, but if you have to rely on that argument, then you have a weak argument on the case itself. Because then you're saying treat people differently based on their status, treat former presidents differently, and that's not the ideal no one's above the law sort of situation where ideally it'd be enforced equally. And here, the reason why the conviction of these crimes took place in New York City, in a very blue place, is because the crimes took place there. And that's what happens in the jurisdiction, and thus that's where it had to be prosecuted. And that's completely normal. And sometimes what we'll hear is, you know how we'll hear from MAGA that Biden should, if he's really not involved, he should intervene. And we've heard some figures say this. He should intervene and try to stop Trump from being prosecuted. But they make the argument he is intervening and causing Trump to be prosecuted. Wrong, but that's the theory they're pushing. And that's bad. But if he's not doing that, he should intervene. So the intervention is not the bad part, but it should just be to help Trump, which the mechanisms by which Biden would do that with this case, since it's not a federal case, is confusing. And even federal cases, that would be horrible for him to involve himself in it. And it's a similar thing here where for political reasons, because of who Trump is, they are advocating he should be treated differently. They just think he should be treated better. We think he should just be treated normally, as if he wasn't the person that he is. And that seems to be more logically consistent, but here's the next moment.
There's no doubt that he engaged in...
All right, I'll tell. Here's my response to that. And I said this on my show the other day. I don't know what kind of weird marriage these two have. Same as I didn't know what kind of weird marriage Bill and Hillary Clinton had. So I don't know what their covenant is in terms of what he's allowed to do on the outside of his marriage.
But again, I don't mind the sex, but when you're paying
problem.
But I'm not talking about the sex. I'm talking about the $130,000 to keep her quiet to protect his campaign.
Immoral. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing.
Really? Okay. Look, again,
if somebody runs for office, they just lose the right to have any privacy. They just have to let us see all of their dirty laundry from the moment they declare forward, or somehow they've done something morally wrong or legally wrong.
When you're doing it to protect the campaign and you are spending money on it, then now I'm going to switch back to the legal. You are now crossing the line into legal problems. Right?
You aren't. That's absolutely not right. Incorrect at every level.
Again, the idea that let me back up. And you don't think he falsified business records either?
I don't know what he did. I don't think he wrote down.
What does that mean? We just had a whole...
Okay. I don't know what he did. Well, then why are you a part of this conversation? See, it's so aggravating. It sort of feels sometimes, why are all of these legal analysts, Aaron Parnas, who you're about to hear from, and many, many others, doing the work to dive into the specifics of what was brought forward at trial and giving us takes, if the argument is happening in a much more abstract place for these MAGA folks? to the point where when Dan Abrams brings it back to the case, but I'm talking about the legality, she says, well, I don't know what he did. But is talking about something about a marriage and how she doesn't know what Trump's obligation to Melania was, and was he cheating? I don't know. What? No, it is sort of annoying that Party of Family Values doesn't care about the underlying story there. Not that that's what was illegal, but it is strange that y'all are willing to look past as Melania is taking care of a newborn, Trump's out cheating with a porn star. But that's not the criminal part. And then when we get into the actual criminal part, now we're talking about, oh, but a former president, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we're not actually having a debate about the law, about if he violated the law. You just want to make an exception for him. I guess that's an argument you could bring forward. I just think it's a ridiculous one. So with all that being said, I do want to talk about something big that's happening today, which is that Trump is having to sit for an interview with a probation officer. And this is a pretty big deal, crazy thing to be happening. So I do want to bring in our legal expert, Aaron Parnas, to discuss. Aaron, great to be with you. And give us, before getting into specifics too much, give us a sense of what we should expect today.
So for the first time in a long time, Donald Trump is being treated like any other criminal defendant after his previous felony conviction on those 34 felony charges. Now, Trump is sitting down for a probation interview with a probation officer from New York City. This interview will be over Zoom, and this is pretty standard that any criminal defendant has to go through between conviction and sentencing. The probation department is putting together a report that is going to outline the charges, Donald Trump's criminal history to the extent there is any, his background, his financial background, his employment history. It's essentially a deep dive, a deep background check into a criminal defendant's life. And then at the end of it, the probation department will give a recommendation for what it ultimately thinks Donald Trump should receive at sentencing, whether Donald Trump should receive an incarceration type sentence, whether probation is appropriate for him, whether some type of home confinement. Probation will give their recommendation, and Justice Merchan will be able to use this when sentencing Trump on July 11th.
And I'm assuming that this is being recorded, but we're not going to get to see that recording, right?
Yeah, this will never become public. The recording won't become public, and oftentimes the actual report itself does not become public either. The probation department's report and the recommendation will likely become public because either Judge Merchan or prosecutors or defense attorneys will reference it in their briefs that they file in advance of sentencing. But the actual report itself is almost always redacted because it contains a ton of personal information. And in this case, probation is going to get a lot of records that Donald Trump has previously resisted giving to the public. I mean, anywhere from his past employment records to tax returns to things like that, probation could get access to verify income and things like that. So ultimately, it's going to have a lot of information that will never see the light of day.
Right. And you already touched on this a little bit, but give us, what are we looking for? Key things that will be asked that could impact sentencing the most?
Yeah, so one of the big things that this probation department report is going to look into is Donald Trump's current liquid assets, because as part of any potential sentence under the law, Donald Trump could pay a potential fine to New York. So probation has to determine whether Donald Trump can pay a fine, and if so, how much. So because at the end of the day, you don't want to recommend that a criminal defendant pay a $10,000 fine when they only have $5 to their name. It's just an unjust, punitive sentence. But here, probation is going to look into Trump's finances to see how much and whether he could pay a fine. He likely will be able to. That's number one. Another part of this will be just to get Donald Trump's employment background. Typically, what probation looks at is whether or not a criminal defendant has a sufficient employment history such that they can survive after any potential sentence. Here, it's not really that big of a deal because Donald Trump is, at least he claims to be a billionaire. So ultimately, he will be able to survive on his own, no matter what the sentence is. But that is also something that they're going to look into. In any event, this is standard protocol. There are a number of standard questions that probation is going to ask him. But I think the biggest takeaway here is the fact that this is just a major intrusion into anyone's life. This is the last thing anyone wants. You do not want to sit in front of a computer screen or in person with a probation officer going through the minutia of the past 30, 40, 50 years of your life. because that's what Trump is going to have to do. It's going to take several hours. It's going to take him off the campaign trail, or rather off the golf course. And ultimately, no matter what it says, it's just going to be a major distraction and nuisance for Trump, just like it is for most criminal defendants.
And then after this interview, and this might be sort of rehashing stuff you've touched on a little bit, but what are the next steps? So the interview happens, and the next steps as we lead into the sentencing decision being made by Judge Juan Merchan.
Yeah, so the interview is actually just one part of the probation department's report. So they're going to interview Trump. They're going to interview a number of people in his life, a number of witnesses, a number of, and they're going to run significant background checks into his past. They're going to compile what is called a probation report or a pre-sentence report. That pre-sentence report will then be distributed in the coming weeks to both Todd Blanche, Trump's attorneys, as well as District Attorney Alvin Bragg, and also to Justice Merchan. And at the end of that report, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a sentencing recommendation that probation recommends. Then Judge Merchan will use this report when sentencing Trump. He will look at the report and the recommendation when imposing his own sentence. And both prosecutors and defense attorneys will have the opportunity to, in advance, to object to various parts of the report. Say, for example, probation gets part of it wrong or improperly adds on an extenuating factor that could increase Trump's sentence. Defense attorneys will likely object to it for a number of grounds. So without knowing what's going to be in there, I can't really speculate, but you're going to see a number of court filings around this pre-sentencing report in the coming weeks.
Well, crazy times, crazy stuff, and it's great to have you with us every step of the way. Aaron, where can people find you?
On all my social platforms, just at Aaron Parnas.